And it looks like we're live. Good evening, everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Good evening, all you wonderful people.
Okay, you said it was going to be a chill stream, but Shadow, you're taking it to another level.
Well,
That
I'm
that
usually
voice.
I'm usually lazy as fuck when I'm not in break room streams. Blame everyone else for that.
Way to get a slump in your chair.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I will. Thank you for asking.
You know, right before I hit the stream button, I said this is going to be different from break room. Glad to know things haven't changed.
Yeah.
It's not my fault that it's not my fault that it travels two different ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what is the topic for today?
Tonight's topic is how Watchmen ruined comics, I think.
Well, it's just between that or like discussions on like superhero media, at least nowadays, in terms of how they go in comics and shit. But this is mostly just like from the jumping off point of Watchmen.
Okay, so are we specifically talking about how, like, Watchmen, the comic, ruined comics, or the fans of Watchmen who think it's the best thing ever ruined Watchmen?
Technically speaking, I think it's both because both points are kind of important to like how Watchmen sort of like swept in and essentially just kind of consumed most of the shit that goes on with like writing for superhero stories now.
It's like everything has to be dark and gritty. There always has to be a subversion. You can't just have, like, the idealistic superhero anymore.
Now, this is actually really funny that you point this out because I do vaguely remember that there was a forum thing that I remembered seeing that was a character rant thing, and one thing that they bring up is the fact that the post's main topic was discussing how like simple idealistic characters are just as good as complicated subversive ones, and then I'm sitting here and I'm like, well, technically speaking, if you kind of think about it, like the super simple idealistic ones are actually can be just as interesting and subversive as the characters that are notably dark and gritty because there's you kind of like peel back long enough you can sort of see a reason for why they act the way they act, and it's mostly because like doing good is just the right thing to do. I pointed out in the post that the big thing is literally it's just people, at least in this day and age, literally cannot fathom the concept of good. Like it can't just be like straightforward Boy Scout stuff anymore because there always has to be like something specifically that like clinches them that shows like, oh, this is totally realistic. And then there's also the point of the mind of like, I like my characters to be uber powerful and shoot lasers out of their armpits or shit.
Hold on, we got a comment from Lizardman for Prez. He says, everyone wanted a new Watchmen, which brings me into what I think the actual problem with Watchmen was. It's not that Watchmen itself was bad, because Watchmen is actually fantastic, but what people took away from it, what ended up the actual influence that Watchmen had was a bigger detriment than anything that Watchmen could have provided. This is going to be a really weird example, but it's exactly like how Steven Universe on its own isn't that bad, but it's when everyone tried to copy that art style that everyone pointed back to Steven Universe and said this show is shit.
And to be fair, like on that same point, I will definitely sit and defend saying fucking saying that Watchmen by itself is really good because it kind of stands on its, like, reading it by itself, like, not even like looking into like how it affects like how upstart writers back in the days when they were reading Watchmen would like come up and be like, I'm gonna write some super cool, subversive, realistic superhero story that's gonna be just like Watchmen. Because like the big thing is like when Watchmen first came out, Watchmen was like sort of unique for the time because it was essentially taking the superheroes and then peeling off the mask to show that they're literally, like, most of them are literally just everyday people. The only person in the comic who was the only superpowered one was Dr. Manhattan. And Dr. Manhattan's big shtick was the fact that like he was so superpowered and so like powered beyond humans that most people just didn't know how the fuck how to interact with him.
And then
like the big shit was that like no one knew how to interact with Dr. Manhattan in the comics, so most of them were just scared shitless of him.
And then he got sick of that so much he literally just fucked off to Mars.
Yeah, basically speaking. I mean, like, my big thing is that a lot of people, like, take a lot from, like, the realistic characters from Watchmen, and they essentially just tried to bring them over without, like, remembering the setting that Watchmen was set in, which was very much, like, a vaguely, like, super grudgy, noir-esque. And when I say noir, I mean, like, really dark, sort of, like, grungy shit. Yeah, it's just sitting here, and it's, like... And, like, the weird thing is, like, if you really think about it, like, some of the characters, like, are kind of boring when you kind of look past their masks and shit. And then you have a lot of people that want to, like, write crazy characters that are just like Rorschach, and they're just forgetting the fact that Rorschach was fucking nuts.
Rorschach was basically Batman, but without the money, so he just ends up like a crackhead.
Yeah, essentially, and for the most part, the big thing is that what Watchmen did that was really interesting when you read it by itself was the fact that Watchmen, essentially, what it does is it looks at the people, like peels the mask off, shows that they're just humans, and then literally deconstructs them to the fact of showing off that like these are just regular people dealing with regular shit. And then it's being superheroes that fucks them over in some regard.
Yeah.
Because, like, are you really going to sit here and tell me that, like, Rorschach being a superhero somehow, like, manages to help in any way all of his mental baggage and shit that goes on? Because, like, he is super fucked up. Because, like, there's that stuff and there's all this crazy, all this extra, like, the people who, like, take being a hero really seriously, like Ozymandias, who takes it to such an extent that he manages to spoilers for a really old ass fucking comic book, by the way.
Spoiler alert for a comic that came out in 1985.
Yeah, he literally like
and a movie that came out in 2009.
Okay, in the movie's defense, like Ozymandias' reason, like his idea for like bringing people together made more sense than what happened in the comics. But this is probably just give or take on my part. Because, like, in the comics, like, he takes being a hero to such an extent that in order to feel like he can bring the people of the world together, he literally brings a fucking space monster, psychic space squid thing, to come down to be destroyed by the military. And we're kind of just sitting here, and, well, like, I was just sitting, like, figuring that out, and I'm like, okay, you're taking this whole this heroic martyr shit way too fucking seriously if you think that bringing this giant fuck you psionic squid monster to just come into this city to just start destroying shit and thinking that like normal people, because remember in Watchmen, at least in the comic, most of the cast are mostly just plain normal people aside from Dr. Manhattan. That regular people with regular military could kill an alien.
That's also one of the twists too, eh? Because everybody's like a normal. They're all like normal people trying to deal with the shit of being superheroes, but in the end, it's the crazy one Rorschach, who is the only one who can't let what Ozymandias did go. All the other people are like, you know what? We understand what you did, and you killed millions of people, but we think that it's better. We're not going to say anything. But it's the
It's like
the
you've just
crazy
taken
guy.
you've
It's the
just taken
crazy
the
guy
form
who
of.
can't, who is turns out to be the good guy.
Well, I mean, like, to be fair, they also like build it up like sort of a weird thing they do. The sort of a weird thing they do in the movies where they essentially just sort of superpower up everybody. So they kind of build up more of the emotions. So then there's like this big shtick where there's like all this extra stuff where like shit happens, and like Owlman, I think, either backs Ozymandias into a corner like Manhattan. He's like, "You've taken heroism, and then you've mutilated it." And then I'm just sitting here and I'm like, okay, mind you, I'm neutral to like the Watchmen movie. Like, I don't think it's good. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's kind of meh. So
Well, I
that's just
knew it would
me, and
never
it's kind of.
translate well.
I mean,
I
that's
mean,
what everyone said when it
the
first came out. Like,
Watchmen, the comic is it makes its own mythos, and not to sound like I'm fangirling over it or anything. It's just that it had like a lot of backstory, like in the on the back pages and the inside covers, and it had a lot of like news articles and everything that you could read, and it was like just pages and pages of backstory. Whereas you can't really do that in a movie.
Well, yeah, to be fair, because like in Watchmen, the big thing that they go for the comic is the fact that they sort of have like this side plot meta narrative sort of thing going on, where they have the newspaper trimmings going into like all the history of like the entirety of the Watchmen group from like all of its rotating
Yeah,
round robin team members. And then they also include the fact that this is mostly just happening from the perspective of, again, ordinary people. Like, this is happening from fucking the kid who's just reading comics and newspapers at the newspaper stand, and he's just reading shit like the Black Freighter comics. And then the Black Freighter comics end up having like a huge impact for Ozymandias' shit because he was working with the man who wrote or made it in some way, I think. I'd have to go back and read it over again just to see if that's true or not.
anyway, getting back to the topic, I don't know if this is like like a clinical observation, but I remember when one of my buddies who really liked comic books, he handed me Watchmen and said, "You got to read this. It's great." And I remember before that I was interested in like not really superhero comics, but you know I'd buy like some superhero comics, or I'd watch like the superhero cartoons and stuff like that. And then I read Watchmen and it was amazing. I really liked it. But then after that, I wasn't really interested in superheroes anymore. And I don't know why that would be, but I don't know. I haven't really picked up any superhero comics or anything like that since then.
Okay, well that might have something to do with the fact that like a big reason for why like I personally like have at least choice words for like upstart writers who showed up after reading Watchmen was the fact that Watchmen's kind of cynical.
Yep.
It's like very cynical in the way that it looks through everything because it kind of dresses down the phoniness of being superheroes. Because again, the fact that most of the cast are humans, aside from Dr. Manhattan, it plays up the fact that these are people just hiding behind masks and shit. So it kind of promotes that idea of cynicism. And then that is essentially the thing that a lot of writers take. And then they essentially carried that into like when they like get around to like becoming professional comic book writers is the shit that they brought into when they were coming up with stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering.
This is weird because like in some cases, like I can understand like which comic, like I at least can probably understand like which characters probably do deserve having a bit more of a cynical sort of setup to everything, and then people who really don't, which is really weird. But the thing is that I don't think they really know that. And the real peculiar thing is that they like to bring it into everyone, and then that sort of makes it hard to read superhero stories because they always end up being super homogenous in a way.
Yeah. So like I was saying, it's like did I change after I read The Watchmen, or did just everybody who read The Watchmen, all the comic book writers, did they just start? Because I didn't read it in '85, so I mean, when did it's change? I mean, did it change right after The Watchmen, or did it really start changing in like the late '90s or the mid 2000s, or? Because I do remember that when everything was like super dark.
I think if I had to gauge,
And I wasn't really interested in that.
I think if I had to gauge like the shift from like traditional like sort of stereotypical idealistic superhero stories going into much more darker, more cynical, subversive stories was sort of a slow burn that like went in like from the 90s going into the 2000s. Because like if we can remember, like 90s was like the point where like everyone was trying to be like super extreme and shit. So
Yeah.
Terry Bogard says, I blame Liefeld.
Actually, speaking of which, I think we should read some of the comments.
Yeah. Terry Bogard says, I blame Liefeld.
Well, before that, he said MCU Captain America is a good example of a paragon with complicated and subversive traits.
That I can actually agree with. Like a lot of America's earlier stuff is based, and this is mostly just built on the fact that like if you kind of like squint and look at the base concept, Captain America is actually a really basic character because he's essentially just a soldier or a patriot. He is literally just American patriotism.
He's on drugs.
Sort of symbolized. Hitler 43 times.
True. He did. It's not entirely the point I'm trying to make though, because the thing is with like because of the fact that Captain America is so very simple, with the fact that he is basically just the representative of like American patriotism. It's the fact that he kind of inherits that Boy Scout aesthetic, which kind of makes sense because he's essentially just an American soldier. So him having these super noted sort of Boy Scout traits makes sense. And then it sort of makes sense because these kind of shift in some way because he is very much a representative of like liberty and such. So this would make sense that in regards to like later stuff that happens with like the Civil War series that happens between him and Iron Man, like he's the one that is firmly against their identities being known because he very much points it out in the movie that it simply just removes their right to choose. So it's more just bound on the fact that, well, at least what I took from that was anyone can really be a hero, but it's ultimately the choice that falls on them to be the hero. You are absolutely right, Lizard Man. Civil War II did not really need to happen.
What?
And this is mostly just aside from like smaller things that is in regards to its plot and its sort of, again, very cynical outlook of like, and very like cynical outlook of shit for like security and shit. And this is mostly just going into like vaguely sort of stuff with conformity, given because how quickly Marvel is willing to accept, oh, this kid can see visions. Oh, his visions are probably real. And then just believing those wholeheartedly without like having any sense of like common sense or any sense of individualism to be like, wait a minute, what if this kid's things really can't happen?
Here I was just about to say that I thought like Captain America's whole like Paragon Boy Scout image is just it makes him a perfect foil for like Tony Stark, who's more like a playboy who's kind of more self-centered.
Technically speaking, if you look at it that way, yeah, it kind of is, like, because the more you kind of look at it, it kind of makes sense for the fact that, like, a, like, big comic series will have, like, two characters that are foils to each other, where, like, Captain America has Iron Man because they're both kind of notably human to some extent, but with different outlooks on stuff in regards to their topics, and the fact that America is typically the Boy Scout one, you know, the traditional patriot, whereas Stark is more of the cynical realist of such, because, like, there's definitely, like, I know this is, like, straying from, like, the comics themselves, but, like, for the most part, like, Stark in the movies definitely does have, like, the definite shades of, like, growth for, like, accepting, and this is ultimately, like, leading into, like, the ultimate stuff of, like, dealing with his personal demons throughout most of his stuff before it ultimately culminates into, like, the decision he ends up making at the end of Endgame. Thoughts on Injustice?
Like the games or like the comics and the movie? Because
I was going to say probably it might end up morphing into all three. I was going to say the big thing with Injustice is that okay, here's my thing, and this is like another this is like another like thing that like goes into like writing for superhero stories. Injustice is a really weird case because it kind of is like, it goes into like the traditional like sort of Elseworld stories that DC likes to do, with like a lot taking its characters and then moving them into wildly different concepts. And while this is wildly interesting for characters like Superman, for instance, like Red Sun, which is literally just Superman as a communist. The really interesting thing about Superman is that Superman is, when he was originally created, was very much created to be not human and more like built as an ideal, like the representation of like the idealism itself, because like this is basically the reason why he is usually commonly a foil to Batman, because
actually,
Batman is more cynical than Superman is. But the
Superman,
really weird
Superman didn't even start off as like a superhero story. It was meant to be. It was originally thought of as like a sci-fi story.
To be fair, that does make sense. Sci-fi stories do kind of influence superhero stories in some extent, because like Flash Gordon was sort of an inspiration for a lot of the superhero stuff that happened later. But the really weird thing, or the really specific thing about Injustice that is kind of interesting, is something that you kind of see in like other stuff. You kind of see it in like shit like The Boys with Homelander a little bit, in regards to, well, okay, I say that, but I'm like gonna have to save my point for The Boys later. But the really interesting thing is like, another big thing about like a lot of superhero stories is that a lot of superheroes are kind of boring when you boil them down to just their powers. So the really weird thing is that like it's really hard to like write a Superman story and make it interesting by like delving into like shit about Superman specifically. Injustice is very interesting in the fact that it essentially just takes Superman and takes him away from his ideal, like the idealized Ubermensch persona that he was sort of meant to be. And this is sort of going into your point, Terry, of saying like, wasn't Superman meant to also represent the struggles of Jewish people identifying peoples in the 30s and 40s, because Superman was sort of brought up on the philosophy of being the Ubermensch. The thing with Injustice is that it kind of like takes him away from his idealism to some extent, because it essentially makes him the villain of the story if you kind of like squint and look at it, because you would think that Joker would be the villain for Injustice because of the shit that he does to kickstart it. But no, Joker gets fucking killed early on, and then it essentially goes into like a typical sort of dystopian fight the power story, just so happens the fact that the people they're fighting are superheroes and being led by Superman. Lizardman, when you say Justice League animated might have inspired Injustice, it's very possible because I believe you are talking about the Justice Lord, the part where the Justice League goes off against the Justice Lords, which is something that did happen, which was sparked on by they're very both arcs kind of like follow the same plots where it's essentially just
Whoa, what happened? We lost him.
Oh, I think it's internet. Your internet sucks.
okay, if you complain about it, I will leave. Anyways.
My apologies, your internet is fantastic.
So yeah, when you kind of look at it, the Justice Lords arc that happened in the animated Justice League story did kind of sort of inspire the base concept for Injustice, because they both kind of follow the same beats and they both kind of essentially follow the same thing, where it's like one Justice League fighting against another Justice League. It just so happens that so yeah, basically speaking.
So here's the thing. Way back in the golden age of comics, and even in like the silver age, comics were really were made for and targeted to like young kids. And then over time, I mean, those kids grew up, obviously, but I mean, I guess, it seems like the whole audience as a whole, like what the comics publishers are targeting has changed. So it's no longer for kids. Like Superman used to like throw a car or something, and all the kids would be like, "Wow, that's great, that's amazing." But now, it's like that would be something that they'd put in a comic, and it would have to. I don't know. It's something that simple would not go over well, because I guess I don't know that the target audience has changed, and in the case
I don't want my kids trying to pick up a car.
Well, not that, but I mean, it was just
they might hurt themselves.
The kids would read it and they'd be like, "Wow, that's amazing! What these people are doing." That's not so much they care for the characters, like the characters' backstories. They just want to see crazy characters do amazing things. And it's only when the readers grew up that they started wanting, more of a layered superhero, or a deeper superhero. And I don't know, could you say that that kicked off with Watchmen, like in earnest? Because I'm sure there were other dark and gritty comics before Watchmen, but after, it seemed like that's the people who wanted Watchmen were the group of people that the publishers were now targeting. Like, now we want this audience, and there's no kids comics anymore. I mean, there's kids comics, but it's not like superhero comics anymore.
When you say it like that, that makes a lot of sense, because you also have to consider the fact that there's also like additional stuff that took into account, like the comics code that happened like way back, that was sparked by like the horror comics that happened like way earlier. So then that sort of influenced stuff with comics. But the big thing I think is the fact is that superhero writers like really wants to like hammer in the fact that like anyone can be a superhero. So what they want to do is they're like stretching their net to such an extent that they can encompass literally everyone into that sort of mold.
And then when
And
everyone's super, nobody will be.
that's sort of the logic behind it. Like, yeah, give him credit. Like, yeah, it sounds like super cliche when Syndrome says it, but like, you kind of take it and like put it into like a more interested thought. He's kind of right, because there's kind of like there's sort of this unique sort of power that being a superhero kind of gives you, because it kind of feeds into the typical idea of idealism for like, yes, I was from a sort of harsh area. Now that I have powers, I can finally make a difference and make people feel better. So yeah, there's sort of that, and that's nice. And then like them extending their net to such an extent that they can encompass like all different identities to incorporate all these extra people to become superheroes. Like, yes, that's nice and all, but you also have to remember the fact that like you have to take in all this extra stuff that happens, because like another big thing that like a lot of modern writers want to do is they want to make superheroes really, really realistic. So they have to tackle like all these super like realistic, hard-hitting issues while also still wanting to try and be campy.
Yeah, and that is like a total contrast to how superheroes first came about in like the 40s to the 60s, where they were just totally uncomplicated people with crazy powers, solving very uncomplicated problems, and kids just ate it up. And
it's not even the fact that the issues that they were dealing with that superheroes would typically deal with is like not complicated. It's more the fact that like it's so much grander in scale that people can sit back and say, "Oh, this is totally unrealistic. I can totally get behind this." It's sort of going in for like that popcorn factor sort of stuff.
I just
Mm-hmm.
kind of got distracted by how high your voice went there.
Charming.
It's his superpower.
So yeah, basically speaking, it's more on the grounds of the fact that like superhero stories can have the potential to be so grand in scale, but then you kind of bring it down to just also hammering in the fact of like, oh, this superhero who's capable of turning into mass being of light and shoot plasma energy out of his hands and fire it out of his eyes and fly through space without a suit and shit, also happens to have all these deep personal issues to work through. And then when you put it like that, like, yeah, it makes sense. But when you like make that like the grand thing that they have to deal with, as opposed to like the grander scale villain of the story, it kind of makes it sort of hard and boring to read.
Well, here's another question for you. Do you think that the whole tide of comics turning towards like a dark and gritty shtick or whatever, do you think it would have happened as fast if Watchmen had never existed, or at all if Watchmen had never been written?
Okay, as it stands, I would probably believe that if Alan Moore did not write Watchmen, it probably would have been at a much slower extent than it has, because of people wanting to like throw all this extra stuff onto characters where it doesn't entirely make sense. But then there's also the fact that like the big thing is mostly the fact that like if we didn't have Watchmen, we wouldn't have gotten someone like Frank Miller, who had like for all his credit who had like wonderfully amazing runs on stuff like Daredevil and shit. So so yeah, and then there's like
I think it's
Yeah,
more
it's like,
that people looked at Watchmen and got the wrong thing from it.
and what exactly do you think that would be?
I think people forgot about the whole the whole superheroes are actually like real people thing and said, "Oh, we should just make our superhero comics dark and gritty like Watchmen."
Yeah, that makes sense when you say it like that. Definitely
I mean, we could have an
does.
entire discussion on how one of the entertainment industry's favorite pastimes is taking the wrong lesson away from everything.
Yeah, it's really weird how it can do that.
And apparently, I'm only, and it wasn't until like this. Apparently, it's not just in comics or animation, or to like film and animation. Apparently, it applies to everything now.
Technically speaking, that definitely would make sense. But in order to keep everything grounded, I want to say probably just keeping this podcast specifically in regards to like superhero stories. So, like in this regard, like pointing out like this characters that would make sense for like a sort of gritty, sort of cynical outlook. Certain characters can make it work. Characters like Daredevil, characters like Batman, maybe Spawn if you want to like squint and look at him hard enough and like not count the very Diablo 3-esque escalation of conflict between angels and demons and shit, but mostly demons. Like for the most part, cynicism definitely works for those characters. It works for characters like Deathstroke. It works for characters like Deadpool, which is a really interesting case because Deadpool is is a very cynical story because he's a very sort of cynical character, but at the same time, he's sort of dopey because he's very much like essentially a wisecrack. And that's the big takeaway that everyone gets from Deadpool. Deadpool's literally just the wisecrack sort of vicious rated R character that is like sort of like leaning to like show to kids, but at the same time can relate to kids so well. Like he's like I almost want to argue he's a 90s kid that became a superhero to some extent. Because you also gotta love that like Deadpool, like for the most part, despite being like super violent at times, definitely does have like that sort of manic teenage energy to him.
I thought it was the cancer.
Okay, that too, but
Like,
Well, for me, Deadpool is more like because the whole breaking the fourth wall aspect of his character. That it's more like he's in, I guess, in the universe of the comics, he's like a real person, but it's almost like it's just the comic book writers saying, you know, if you took like a 13-year-old kid and you said, uh, you know, you can star in your own comic book, you know, what would you do? You know, and well, whatever age where a kid is no longer like a Superman fan and they're not yet like a Batman fan, you know, like the gritty Batman fan, it's like smack in the middle of it. It's like you still want the fun superhero, but you also want like guns and beating the shit out of people.
asking a 13-year-old like what would you want out of a superhero is actually really good comparison to like what Deadpool essentially is. Because like that's the other really interesting thing about Deadpool. Deadpool's interesting. The fact that he can lean on the fourth wall so much that he practically sleeps on it. It kind of helps like give him charm because at the same time there's also this fact like because he's a wisecrack, because he has such an interesting like kinetic energy that he can kind of like throw off and like throw humor into like, well, super dark humor, snappy humor, but humor nonetheless is the shit that's just. It's the fact that he like leans on the fourth wall. It like gives you the idea of like, oh, he's in on the joke. He knows he doesn't want to be taken seriously, but at the same time, he doesn't expect us to take him seriously.
Yeah, and there's that element of kind of placing your own self in that role, just because Deadpool knows he's in a comic book. So it's a kind of a weird form of escapism when you think about it.
It actually is really funny that Deadpool is based off Deathstroke, and they're both okay, because that's another thing you have to remember. Like, when Marvel and DC were like really big in the comic industry, because they kind of really aren't anymore because of like all this extra stuff that goes on with their writing and shit.
Like the DC YA novels that Lizardman brought up in the comments.
Yeah, because like a big thing you have to remember with like Marvel and DC, they kind of like taking pot shots at each other. It's really funny. It's basically like how Ryu exists in Street Fighter, and then they have Rio in one of the SNK games. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that Deadpool is based off Deathstroke. They both essentially have the same costumes and baseline powers and shit. But there's also the fact that's just Deadpool's just kind of the funner one out of the two. Like, I won't lie, Deathstroke is interesting in the fact that it's basically just DC wanting to have an anti-hero character. And then there's also the fact that it like goes into like the mindset of a mercenary assassin and shit. And then you have Deadpool just sitting around here just being super fun and shit, and being like the one like super aggressive, violent character that everyone's like, haha, this is fun.
But yeah, seriously, Deadpool's superpower is just... It's just hyperactive cancer.
Yeah, like even like based on that just sounds like something a really tongue-in-cheek, like super witty writer would come up with as a joke, and it somehow works for Deadpool. Cause like they give him like this super like, if I'm remembering correctly from his origin story, they give him this super edgy story where he's basically just he was in prison and then he was put in for gene splicing experiments. And then he was a big bet in the prison betting pool they called the Deadpool. And then he lived through most of the surgeries. And then he came out as a wisecracking assassin man. It's like it sounds super edgy. Like if you kind of like look back and like kind of think about it. But at the same time, you also remember the fact that like Deadpool's a sort of a joke character. Because like I'm trying to remember like, if I would have to look it up again, but I believe Deadpool has a stone that actually allows him to warp reality itself. So Deadpool is basically just the really fun one because they know he's a comic book character, and then they're essentially just playing up the fun of being like this super violent character who is at the same time really fun to fucking read for. So fucking yeah. Oh wait, shit, that's right. DC really did start. Oh yeah, that's right. DC really did do a bunch of young adult stuff. Well, I mean, to be fair, that sort of makes sense. Marvel and DC nowadays are
suck.
Yeah, Marvel and DC at this point are like really trying to like hammer hard into like the young adult audience. And the young adult audience, like at least nowadays, is like very vocal with like wanting to like have realistic stuff with like realistic representation and stuff like that, and that makes sense.
You know how in a video game they say that if you're dying over and over and again, you're essentially just throwing your corpse at the enemy?
Yes, that is something that is thrown around a lot.
Yeah, I think that's the equivalent of what's happening with Marvel and DC now.
Cause like here's the thing, like just so everyone knows and like doesn't like jump to conclusions and like start throwing our podcast around so that we start getting shit from other people. Like I am totally for like real like having like some semblance of realism or some semblance of like representation for stuff and like representation for other identities and stuff. Like I totally am okay with that. But it's the big thing is that like for the most part, and this sort of ties into like a big thing that I have with like creating characters in the first place is that they sort of take the identity of the character and they make that their whole shtick. They don't do anything really interesting with the identity itself. They're essentially just taking the identity, plastering it onto someone, and it's essentially just sitting there, and it's like, okay, yeah, that's it, we're done. We don't need to do anything else. And to be fair, when you say it like that, yes, accurate representation is just treating characters as if they are real people. Because, like, that's the thing. Like, for the most part, if you, like, to make them really interesting, like, if you want, like, for the sense of representation, you would have it, like, be there. But for the most part, it wouldn't be, like, the most pivotal part of their character. Because, like, they are more than just their represented identity and stuff like that. There are, like, their quirks, their fears, their passions and stuff like that, their relationships. And more than just their powers and sort of their outlooks on other characters and shit.
Yeah, it really ties into like what people like. The word diversity has been kind of tainted for a lot of people now because instead of actually being like an inclusive term to a lot of people, it essentially now means, oh, we're just putting in like this other ethnicity person here just so we don't have to take criticism.
We have to fulfill a quota.
A token.
Oh, our main character's gay. You can't criticize us, otherwise you're a homophobe. That's pretty much what they do now.
Our new Superman is bisexual. Okay, and?
No, that's it. Buy our comic, you bigot.
And that's the big question that I have to ask is like, okay, our character is super unique because they have this super unique identity and stuff. And then I'm just sitting here, I'm like, okay, and what else are you going to do with the character?
No. You see, they're gay.
Are you just?
Well, I think that's one thing that you can't blame Watchmen for ruining, because that happened outside of that.
Oh yeah, that happened a lot later, but
that was going to happen anyway.
But it kind of like plays into the fact that like characters want to be cynical, so they want to like tackle like the real world stuff with like a sort of cynical, but at the same time sort of like realistic look at everything.
I think
the Watchmen didn't ruin everything about comics.
Oh no, I wouldn't say that Watchmen like completely ruined everything about comics, but it's sort of like is like the thing you can kind of look at and then look at the other stuff and then you can kind of look at and then like you kind of tilt your head and squint with like one eye closed and then you kind of look past all the really interesting stuff that Watchmen does by itself and it's like okay, yeah, I can see how this sort of influenced them because I'll be like completely blunt, like aside from Watchmen, which I have like super vague knowledge of, the really big Alan Moore story that I really like is V for Vendetta.
Lizardman for Press says they can't do anything interesting because they would get canceled, going back to the whole like diversity thing. And yeah, that's kind of the problem that Marvel and DC have kind of gotten themselves into, because to them, if you make like a black person, they're not just like, they don't just happen to be black. Like anything that character does is somehow a representation of that person's entire race. So you can't really do anything interesting with them. have you guys ever heard of like the Guybrush fallacy or whatever it's called, the Guybrush principle?
It rings a bell.
No, I actually haven't heard of it. Please
Okay,
explain.
it refers to the protagonist of the Monkey Island games, the Guybrush whatever.
Guybrush
And
Threepwood. Yeah, I know. I figured that much.
the whole thing is that the reason why the writers are able to treat him with as much crap as they do is because he's essentially a white male.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah, I've heard of this.
therefore an acceptable target. If you make him a woman, you can't have the exact same thing because then it would look bad on women. You can't make him black because then it would look bad on black people, whatever. So really, the only reason why the writers were able to do like Guybrush period and have him be like this lovable loser is because, well, he's a white male and nobody cares what happens to him.
Easy target. Yeah, that makes sense when you say it like that. That definitely does put like a lot of stuff into perspective now, because it definitely does like also like play into the fact that like a lot of identities that a people will ask to be represented and stuff, usually they do it with like the veneer of like them being protected in some way. They're the protected ones, and like there's nothing that can be said or done against them in any regard. And then I'm just sitting here and I'm like, well, I mean, like, I know you're being like super emotional about it and stuff like that because they're a marginalized identity, but like making them out so that they can do no wrong just doesn't work. That just doesn't happen realistically. Keyword, realistically, it doesn't really happen that much.
Right.
Or it shouldn't really happen that much. Yeah, victim mentality. So sort of plays into it. All right, so going back, hold on. I'm trying to remember something that I remembered bringing up at least one day ago that I wanted to bring up here in regards to like superhero stories. And this is more or less like the thing for like sensationalism for like creating like superheroes in general, but like for the most part, because a lot of characters like they want to paint them a lot as like one-offs that like don't have that much presence in the setting, but like the big thing for like villains is or for superheroes is like to give them a rogues gallery and shit like that, because like giving them like a steady little collection of villains to like bounce off of is like their big thing. But then there's also the fact that like people will have like favorites in the rogue gallery, and I think people are probably getting where I'm going to be going with this, and it's the fact that yes, I'd like to bring up at least a little thing that like despite all the good that Batman does, that there is something that most writers tend to like do that becomes incredibly draining, and it's not really using the hero's rogue gallery to their fullest extent, because they only end up having like one character that is the most recognizable, who ends up carrying most of the shit around.
Joker fatigue.
Joker fatigue is a real thing.
Yeah, Tiger Beam Productions says again, make them flawed and like real people. That's exactly what we're doing with Monster Hospital. That I wanted to do a series. Because Monster Hospital, when you get right down to it, the whole series is about character development.
Oh yeah, that was a big thing when the concept was being pushed. The concept was really being pushed for the fact that like it's literally they're monsters on the surface, but then you look past that and they're basically human just like everyone else. They just don't look human.
And literally issue 1, Claire ends up having to learn something about herself. Character development is the human existence. Exactly. In fact, I believe that if your main character doesn't fail at some point, then you need to rewrite the character, because if your character doesn't fail, then they can't go through character development, and therefore they don't learn anything from their mistakes, and therefore they can't grow as a character.
Failure is experience, for the most part.
It doesn't have to be a big loss, it doesn't have to be like the end of Infinity War, but the point is the character needs to learn something, and it needs to stick.
Mary Sue syndrome. Yeah, so that's a common thing a lot of writers have issues with when they're writing characters, especially ones that they're like really proud of and they want to like push for, because they want to make them be like perfect without failing, and then it's because of that they end up becoming the most insufferable characters in the world.
Some people never want to change, they just want to change the world to fit themselves. I think that's one of the big problems we have today. It's that because here's the problem. The truth is, you need to change yourself. If you can't change yourself, you can't change the world. A lot of people forget that first part.
It's kind of odd to think about too, because back in the, when comics were first coming out in the golden age, there wasn't any character development. It was I mean,
super simple.
Superheroes, they would fail every now and then, and then they would, get back up and dust themselves off, because that's, what heroes do, and then they'd beat the bad guy. And there wasn't any. It was basically a giant, sitcom-esque, where everything just resets back to the way it was for the next comic. Nobody really learned anything.
Right, and
but yet they just they sold like crazy. So I mean, could it be like that the audience has changed? Like,
yeah, because to be fair, this is basically extending into the fact that like in the golden age, like because there was like so little pushed for them, the heroes were essentially just pushed as more the ideals behind the masks as opposed to people behind the masks. And then as like time progressed, people started looking at stuff with a more cynical and a more realistic look, and then they're looking at us and they're like, yeah, these are people that can leap over buildings and race past bullet trains and shit, but they're still people. And like, yeah, for the most part.
Because
then you're also forgetting the fact that like they can sort of leap buildings and run past trains really fast.
Yeah, but I mean, when you think about it too, it's like all those comics that sold, millions of copies back then to kids. But I don't think you could even sell those comics to kids these days. I mean, just think of the explosion of just the young adult fiction, where kids, they want deep stories. So I mean, what is it? Have kids just gotten better educated in the last like 50 years? I mean, obviously they have, but to an extent where they want like a parents reading to them earlier, or because I don't think kids would stand for the kinds of stories that were, on the shelves way back when.
Yeah, for the most part, it's mostly because a lot of stories nowadays like have more going on in them, so that's why they have to throw so much more shit at the characters. And then this is why, like, for the most part, whenever he's brought up as being like the one good DC character, Batman is typically brought up on grounds because there's so much shit going on with him, aside from the fact that he was originally just a dude who wears a bat suit to scare people because his parents were killed in an alley. Because like the big thing they like to push is the fact that like
he was literally really more of a detective back then.
Yeah, essentially speaking, the big thing they really like to push is the fact that a lot of his rogues gallery is essentially just like extensions of his character because they're all like taking bits and aspects from him as a character and then just going like, okay, what if it's this part of Batman but evil? Like Two-Face is essentially just Batman's thing with justice flipped on its head. Penguin is just Batman's wealth flipped on its head. Scarecrow, Batman's use of fear to intimidate his enemies, flipped on its head.
I never thought of it that way before. That's actually really good.
Yeah, that's the really interesting thing. That's the big thing that everyone like really likes to throw for like Batman being the really interesting DC character because a lot of his rogues gallery is super interesting. It's really weird because for the most part, even when he was revealed and even like for like the early eras when he
Bane,
was
Batman's strength turned on his head.
Yeah, essentially speaking, like using power to intimidate. Yeah. Turned on its head. And then you get weird cases like Joker, which is like the weird thing because Joker doesn't really fulfill like any aspect of Batman's personality.
Oh, I beg to differ.
But it's how so? Because the big thing that they really like pushing for Joker is the fact that Joker's such a chaos factor in Batman's life that the two essentially complete each other in a really, really twisted sort of way.
What if I told you that Joker is Batman's insanity turned on his head?
When you say it like that, that makes a lot of sense.
Cause here's the thing: Batman is also kind of fucked up in the head. The difference is he uses his fucked up brain and his money to help people.
Whereas Joker is essentially just crazy murderer for the sake of being crazy murderer.
Pretty much. I can't even say he's self-serving because he literally just.
He's really not. Well, I mean, like to be fair, it actually would make sense for like, okay, Joker being like the flipped side of like Batman's ability to like stay as like the force of order for Gotham makes a lot of sense because Batman like instills order. Joker merely exists to create chaos because it's simply like the thing that will always keep them fighting.
I can do anything.
Yeah, basically. So yeah, for the most part, most of Batman's gallery of villains is actually really interesting. It's only just
Chella said, and this is why I stick to manga. Good news. Monster Hospital is formatted like a manga.
Yeah.
It reads left to right, but otherwise it's manga formatted.
Yeah. So anyways, when I'm like going into like, yeah, Batman's rogue gallery is like really interesting, but the really weird thing is that a lot of characters, because of like how prevalent like certain ones are, they only like give like presence to like only a handful. Like, okay, like the big thing is like you will never fucking see like a huge issue where like Freeze is the main villain, you know what I'm saying? Because for the most part, that title is always reserved for Joker. I will admit Joker's psychology is interesting in the fact that like he exists as the opposite to Batman's order because he is literally chaos personified. But it gets to the point where there's so much content about Joker that it makes you wonder why the fuck the rest of the Rogues Gallery exists when all Batman ever has to deal with is some fucking dude in fucking clown getup. I mention this because there is a Batman comic series that's called The War on Jokes and Riddles, which is a Joker and Riddler story. Riddler is also a really interesting one because Riddler is essentially Batman's intelligence flipped on its head. Because it's pointed out for the most part that Riddler is smart, but he's essentially just smart out of like some sort of neurotic need to be a perfectionist and stuff. So he ends up making all these riddles for people to solve because it's really fascinating. and shit like that.
Actually, since you brought Mr. Freeze before, how would you describe Mr. Freeze?
Mr. Freeze. Okay.
Would you say it's Batman's empathy turned on its head? Because when you think about it, pretty much everything Dr. Freeze does is for his wife who's dying of a disease.
Okay, if I have to argue, like, the big thing that, like, Freeze is, I would argue that he is essentially Batman's heart flipped on its head. Because the big thing with, like, Freeze, that kind of ties Freeze to Batman, is the fact that they're both sort of fueled by loss to some extent. Or at least to at least a crazy extent where they need to feel the need to go out to make sure that they can preserve what they are going to lose, or make sure what they've lost isn't in vain. Because you also have to remember, like, shit with, like, aside from his parents, you also have to remember that, like, a death in the family was a thing. And, like, a death in the family was essentially just Batman dealing with the death of a child when fucking one of his Robins bites it. So they're both essentially powered by loss, and it's sort of like that builds into, like, their heart for caring for people. But it's, again, Freeze is just that flipped on its head, because he is solely determined to try and save Nora, at least when he had his backstory change and he wasn't just a fucking jewel thief. His big thing was essentially he's trying to save his wife, and it's really pushed into the idea that he can't. And he's basically throwing himself against the wall of inevitability and he's kind of like being a child about it, kind of like trying to stop it from happening. Even though it probably could, it probably can't. We don't know, because the medical technology, we don't know if it is that advanced in Gotham or shit like that, or if anyone is willing to actually help Freeze, because if you've ever seen any shit from Injustice 2, everyone doesn't give a shit about Freeze or his wife. For the most part, yeah, that is basically how I see Freeze and Mr. Freeze in a nutshell. So, traveling back to my original point that I was going to make... I want to give you
a round of applause for going through that entire thing without bringing up Arnold.
Well, what the fuck? Why the fuck would I bring up Arnold? Arnold's irrelevant. So anyways...
First Gotham City, then the world!
So yeah, the big thing why his gallery is so interesting, but they always end up focusing on Joker, is because, like, they focus on Joker to such a point that Joker gets kind of boring after a while. And then, like, a lot of people say that Joker's really interesting because, like, at least in the later renditions of the comics, they sort of, like, really play up the fact that, like, Joker and Batman, again, complete each other in a really sick way. They sort of play it up as, like, this sort of twisted romantic thing, and they essentially just go into the fact that Joker is queer-coded. So, like, yeah, I can see that. But then we get to fucking...
some incarnations, maybe. But then that just asks the question, like, are you saying that queer people are insane in that point?
Well, that's a whole other bag of worms that we're not going to deal with right now. Because that would involve, like, going into, like, all the extra... That would involve going into, like, other shit
so
with, like...
I want to talk about how... I think part of the reason why you see Joker all the time is because he's actually... When you think about it, how versatile Joker actually is, because even in, like, movies, like, there's only, like, 2 or 3 types of Batman, but there's, like, a different type of Joker in every incarnation, to the point where you basically just say the actor and you would know what kind of Joker you're talking about.
Hasn't media always dealt with villains being queer-coded? Technically speaking, yes, but for the big point, like, the point that I bring it up for Batman is the fact that a lot of writers and artists, at least in the modern writings for their characters, always end up making it always making it out like Joker and Batman's relationships is sort of a really sick sort of romantic thing, because like in one run for one of Frank Miller's Dark Knight, Batman and Joker literally fight in the tunnel of love. So there's stuff like that. There's like some shit that Joker says about Batman in Arkham Asylum Serious House on Serious Earth, but that's besides the point. Do you want to know the big thing of like how I can believe Joker is versatile, but at the same time not? Do you want to know like the base synopsis of the shit that happens in the jokes of war and riddles? Joker starts a gang war with Riddler because he lost the ability to laugh. So I'm just sitting here and I'm like, okay, now I know Joker fatigue's a thing, because if you like have all this crazy shit to do with Joker, you just make him not.
Actually, why does Joker even need a reason to start a turf war?
I don't fucking know. That's apparently the reason.
You're talking about a character whose main attraction is the fact that he brings chaos. You don't need to give him a reason to do anything.
I know, it's fucking bizarre, because they try to give him a reason for starting the gang war, and then I'm just sitting here and I'm like, okay, now I know that Joker fatigue's a thing if the writers don't even realize the fucking versatility of his character, or the versatility of most of his rogues gallery, if anything, because like for the most part, like jokes and riddles is like technically like has most of his rogues gallery, but they don't fucking do anything. Like the only two that like have like the biggest presence are Joker and Riddler. And yes, in Frank Miller's Dark Knight, Joker does snap his neck.
Maybe sometimes Penguin.
Sometimes Penguin.
Because Penguin was in the Scooby-Doo ones.
Yeah, he was. And I will say, for the most part, like, I will go to bat for, like, a lot of Batman's rogue gallery for being really interesting and wanting to see more for them. Because a lot of older stories do use a lot of them really well. Or, like, stuff like the fucking animated series where, like, I'm remembering where, like, fucking Scarecrow in the beginning had, like, this super fucking cheap, weak-ass design. And then there's at some point where, like, later in the animated series, where it's either in, like, the original animated series or going into the new the new Batman animated adventures, where they straight up just make him look like a fucking preacher with a noose. And I'm just looking at him like, goddamn, that is the coolest design for fucking Scarecrow I have ever seen in my life.
I do like the insanity explanation for why they use the Joker so much, because when you really think about it, both the Joker and Batman are insane.
Yes, of course. Well, yeah, of course they are. The big thing for like a lot of like the people who like say that Batman's a really deep character, and like the reason why like a lot of his stories are sort of cynical, is the fact that he sort of starts a lot of the problems for the Rogues Gallery. He puts them in Arkham Asylum, which is basically just a fucking revolving door for them to just bust out of again. And because of the fact that they're always just a bunch of fucking, most of them are just Batman, aspects of Batman on their heads, there's always this notion that like Batman's efforts
stop putting everything on its head. Just say it's a mirror to...
Yeah, basically. So yeah, that shit happens. Okay, also, one thing I want to point out, because I actually did remember seeing a really big video that like discussed it in length. I don't entirely remember who it was, or who said it, but the big thing that they really like to push, or the person, or at least the thing that they thought was the fact that like Batman is a horror series. And I argue this despite the fact that like there are very horror themed characters like Scarecrow, Professor or Dr. Pig, maybe Victor. That I don't really think Batman's a horror series. Like it's horror tinted at best, but it's not really a horror
It owes
series.
a lot to like the detective aspect of it, because the detective aspect of it came out of the whole hard-boiled noir kind of era and atmosphere. So it makes sense that it's in some kind of like gothic art deco city, you know, where it's nighttime almost all the time.
And this is like the weird thing, because like, okay, yes, Solomon Grundy is totally horror themed because he's literally just a giant hulking fucking zombie man.
Nah.
And yes, they do make more villains for Batman, and this is typically depending on who's writing it. Because for the most part, a lot of the new writers don't like working with the old gallery, so they always end up making like 1,000 new villains for him to deal with. Or in another point that the video liked to discuss, that they had grievances with multiple allies and sidekicks. Okay, my thing is like, I never considered Batman a character for a horror series. I considered Batman a noir character, and like noir in like the investigative detective sense, because he sort of has that knight in sour armor sort of chip on his shoulder thing going on. And it's because of that I think it's interesting, because there's sort of like because noir is a notably underappreciated genre to an extent, because there's sort of despite the fact that it's very investigative, there's usually in like themes of noir like stuff for very fatalistic in some regards, because like it's usually, oh yeah, guy gets involved, person comes into his life.
I didn't want to be here, but here I am.
Person comes into my office, and now I'm laying here bleeding in the street. Yeah, there's sort
myself a shot of whiskey.
So yeah, there's sort of a cynicism already tied to noir. So it sort of makes sense that it fits onto Batman.
Yeah.
He doesn't fit horror that well. And I'm aware that there are at least comics where Batman has done some crazy shit, like Gotham by Gaslight, which is Victorian dealing with a fucking serial killer, The Long Halloween, fucking trying to remember what the fuck the other one is, but I'm trying the name's off the tip of my head, but it's Batman literally just becomes a vampire.
Oh, that's cool, because he's already a bat.
I know, it's funny.
Now he's a vampire bat.
Yeah, he just goes around. He just drinks blood out of a fucking rat.
I can see like the executive meeting where somebody came up with that. And they're like, he's a bat, and there's vampire bats.
What if Batman?
Let's make him a vampire.
What if Batman was a vampire Batman?
A vampire.
Like, oh shit!
It's genius.
Oh shit! So yeah, there's that. There's like that goofy stuff where like you'll occasionally get like goofy shit with like Batman being a vampire drinking blood from a rat and then coming around chopping people up with a fucking axe.
Yeah.
But that's just like one big thing. That's like main series Batman. Main series Batman at his core is mostly just a noir series. And it's at this point where I like point out where like someone mentions like they get pissy where it's like, I don't like the fact that Batman has so many fucking sidekicks and shit. And I'm like, I personally don't see that many issues with it. Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
sorry, I had to leave for a couple minutes.
Yeah, it's fine. We were just sort of.
Oh,
talking.
We didn't notice you were gone.
Yeah, we were just shooting the shit about Batman. I was basically talking about how Batman's not a horror series; it's more of a noir series, because Batman's a noir-esque character, and noir already has like the sort of cynicism thing tied to it. So it's just sitting there, and it's like every time Okay, to be fair, give him credit. He's fucking smart. He has backup plans to like kill every. He could kill every superhero if he had like time to do it.
Yeah, Batman is like one of the few people in Justice League with no powers whatsoever.
Yeah, basically speaking. So yeah, like I consider Batman a noir character, which makes sense because it kind of like makes the cynicism that like goes into his character more natural. Because noir is very much a very cynical sort of style of writing. Because it's very much like very purple prose heavy, and there's always this extra shit where there's like always broody characters and stuff. Yeah, brains over bronze, and basically that shit. And yeah, like aside from like horror themed characters like fucking Solomon Grundy and fucking Scarecrow and Professor Pig and Victor Zsasz and whoever the fuck you want to bring up, maybe Mad Hatter. For the most part, Batman's stuff is like mostly noir. It's really weird because like again, there is like a comic where he literally becomes a vampire. And then there's like all this, and then there's like the Frank Miller stuff that like takes the super gritty cynicism stuff all the way to the fucking extreme. Gotham's like this dude has like doomsayers talking about the end times, and Batman has like a fucking Bruce Wayne is like Batman as a split personality that just starts ratting him out for being fucking weak, and then he starts going into like his
Oh,
Rip Shadow. He got gotten by the Rogues Gallery.
I hate my internet sometimes. I certainly hope my point made sense though, because Miller took the gritty noir-esque stuff for the stuff, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. So
now it's that story where Batman became a vampire. Is that canon, or is that just something that just happened and like they did like a one-off kind of alternate universe kind of deal?
If I'm remembering correctly, the story where Batman becomes a vampire is an Elseworld story, so it doesn't happen in the main canon. So
yeah,
that's just another like look into Batman. Like I can say this because like as it stands, like the big thing that was really interesting was like I don't know if they're doing it anymore right now, but there's like a literal comic series that deals with the Justice League having to deal with alternative reality villain Batmans.
Wow.
Which is
Mirror World Batmans. Okay, millions of them.
Okay, I say this because like there's also the shit where like as an example, there's an alternate version Batman that they deal with who kills the Joker, gets infected with the Joker toxin from something in Joker's heart, and he literally goes fucking crazy. He kills all the Bat family. He fucking kills the Justice League. He poisons Superman. He has Lois and Superman's kid on the station. He throws black kryptonite at them, and then Superman and his son just maul fucking Lois, and then he literally, the Batman who laughs. That's literally who I'm talking about. Thank you, Lizard. And also, Blackest Night is another really interesting superhero story because that's basically just okay. If I had to say, Blackest Night is basically just DC's equivalent to Marvel Zombies to an extent, because it has to do with like this shit with like the Black Lanterns and stuff. I would probably argue like the Lantern Corps is really interesting to me because of like the vagueness of like the emotional spectrum and shit and what can be done with it. And I will personally say that yes, I do think the Black Lanterns are really fucking cool. They're literally just superpowered lantern zombies. Aside from Batman Who Laughs, there's a Batman that gets power from the Speed Force, apparently. Becomes Batman Flash. There's a Batman that becomes Cyborg. I think there's a Batman that's themed around Wonder Woman being a god of war or some shit.
That's not anything new. It's just they're putting Batman into all the other existing superheroes' costumes. It's appropriation.
Yes, it is appropriation. Yes, Dark Knight Metal. That is the one I'm talking about. Thank you, Lizard Man. You're giving me you're making me remember so much stuff.
Somebody is well read with Batman.
Superhero
Well read.
superhero fusion. Well, yeah, that's basically what the villain Batmans are. They're literally just Batman, an evil Batman fused with another villain. I think there's like one that's just evil Batman Green Lantern. No, not Black Lantern Batman. As funny as that would be. I think there's a Batwoman, one of them that is a Aquawoman who plunges the world. Doomsday Batman. I may not know that one. Huh.
Batman Plus. My favorite. It's a subscription service. It's not an actual Batman. It's a subscription service. That's literally every Batman media ever.
Okay, don't make a Warhammer Plus joke, dude.
Wait. That's a thing?
Yeah, that's a thing. Warhammer Plus is literally a thing for Warhammer media. That's why Emperor with a text-to-speech devices got canceled. Hold on, other bag of rocks, by the way. We'll probably get around to talking about...
Okay,
We'll
fuck
probably
Warhammer Plus then.
Yes! I'm remembering, thank you, pointing out their names. It's really weird, because I did remember Flash Batman was just called Red Death. It's very interesting. I'm trying to remember his speed streaks have, like, fucking energy bats going off them. Okay. So, cynicism in superheroes is totally reasonable. It kind of has to fit with the setting and, like, the sort of tone, and it kind of goes with the writer and shit like that. So, like, okay, for examples for, like, cynical characters here, superhero stories that I actually really am interested in like, mentioning, to at least bring up, one that I like to bring up, despite the fact that it is, like, super gratuitous, is The Boys. And it's really weird because, like, The Boys is literally just marketing, just the superheroes marketing. Because the superheroes, at least in The Boys, like, you can kind of tell, like, most of them aren't really heroes. Like, Homelander especially, dude, like, they're all, like, varying shades of assholes. And it kind of makes sense because a lot of the hero main cast really, like, are kind of assholes too. Billy is kind of an asshole because, like, he doesn't really see any semblance of good in most of the soups. So he's kind of just sitting there and he's kind of just stewing on it in his nice sort kind of British, kind of English thing. And, like, for the most part, like, it makes sense, like, for boys to be super cynical because for the most part, it's mostly just, it's kind of almost satirical in a sense because it's kind of paying into the fact that, like, yeah, superheroes are fun and all, but superheroes are fucking terrifying if they're in the real world.
Yep.
Because there's a bunch of shit to be terrified of with superheroes. Like, Homelander's all kinds of fucked up. Black Mask is all kinds of fucked up, at least in the comics. I don't know as much of what the fuck's going on with him in the show. If they're getting a new season or some shit. I think they do something really interesting in the TV show where they have Stormfront, who, like, we know is a fucking, or at least is openly revealed to be just like like someone from really long ago. So they're just a fucking neo-Nazi superhero, and it's the first time I'm hearing that. like, yeah, they go for like some really crazy stuff with like making them in the show a woman and super smart with like the media stuff and like playing to the masses really well and like fucking around with the other characters like Homelander. And it's just really interesting because like the cynicism there just makes sense because like it's kind of just looking at them from a cynical point of view, but also acknowledging the fact that like superheroes are fucking scary to everyday people. I mean, like that's also something that like The Incredibles kind of does.
You know, I'll never forgive the person who told me that The Incredibles is basically just Watchmen for kids.
I don't know. I could see that.
The weird part is you kind of squint and look at it. It's kind of
But I mean,
true.
they actually do have powers, so it's not like they're just, people who have some kind of weight on them where they need to become vigilantes. They're actually superheroes.
Well, which is weird because like in the first Incredibles movie, they really like pushed the idea that they kind of are vigilantes in some way because like he's just Mr. Incredible is just missing the glory days. So he's essentially just brought on to be a vigilante, essentially for yes, gotta squint to get those color values right. I personally I fucking preferred in Mr. Incredible's previous outfit as opposed to his new one. The red just looks kind of tacky on him.
I designed for gods!
I mean, yeah, for the most part, you kind of look at the first Incredibles movie. It's kind of sort of vigilante, and then they kind of poke fun about superheroes again in like the second movie, while also like again doing into like stuff how like people are so easy to like be conformed through like multimedia stuff, kind of on the nose. Thanks, Screenslaver. Too saturated. Not enough complementary colors. That saturated color appeal is that saturated color stuff's the appeal for the outfits, though.
But yeah, going.
Whoa.
As I was about to say.
So if Incredibles 1 is Watchmen for kids, what's Incredibles 2?
Incredibles 2 is basically the sequel everyone wanted, but everyone also kind of got slightly disappointed with. So Incredibles 2 is like the HBO miniseries.
Insert some random rant about Pixar twist villains here. You know what that might be. You know what that might be some shit for another podcast talking about.
You know what? I agree.
The discussion of villains and stories.
Because the first couple of villains that Pixar did actually worked, but now it's basically like, wait, this character that I completely forgot about is the villain? Or, okay, you really had to stretch to make this guy the villain? Or there were absolutely no signs this guy was the villain at all?
If Pixar wants to be super revolutionary, they would make a twist hero instead.
And then John Lasseter pulled the ultimate, like, third act villain move and became one himself.
Yeah.
How the mighty fall.
How the turntables have.
How the fall mighty. Fucking shit. It's really ironic that I bring up like Injustice twisting Superman in a really unique way by essentially making him a fucking dictator when like at the same time I can sit here and totally see like shit happen with Batman and then he essentially goes nuts and then he proceeds to like turn Gotham into a police state. I mean, I already know they're not gonna fucking do it, but I mean, it would totally work. Like, just depends on like what writer you get for it. But yeah, fucking those are all my thoughts on superhero story stuff. Like, if there's like big thing you can take away from this, it's like if your characters are gonna be like idealistic and kind of hokey, then let them be idealistic and kind of hokey. There's no reason to make them super dark and gritty
There's
if they don't need
definitely
to
room
be.
for that in this world. In fact, I think we need it more than ever.
Yeah, it's like that. It's like if they're gonna be sort of goofy, then
Go all
just
the way with it.
just let them be fucking goofy. There's no reason for like to try and there's no reason to be like super gritty and realistic and cynical about all of it. Because if you can pull it off really well, you can. If another thing, if you have like a huge rogues gallery for your villain, make sure you make him kind of interesting and use them all, I guess. Because if you don't, you're gonna run into like Joker fatigue adjacent.
Speaking of goofy, are we ever gonna talk about like Gotham High and I Am Not Starfire? Because boy, are those stupid.
Well, I mean, like we probably could. I'd have to like
not tonight, of course. I'm like maybe those two will get their own episode.
Or like they get thrown into like rebellious teenage stories where like they like people who want to write kid and teenage characters like don't know how the fuck to write kids and teenagers anymore, so they always end up going like straight back to like old.
It's
really
like those
easy
writers
cliches.
It's like those writers were never children.
Oh god, yeah, totally. I mean, like, I could tell, like, I'd have to, like, do some extra reading on I Am Not Starfire to, like, get an idea for, like, what to say for that, but it definitely
I
does
wouldn't
look
even
like
go
it's
that far.
for that.
Just watch Damn Fan, like, read it herself and
Because I'm, like,
idea.
Because I'm, like, sitting here and then I'm realizing, like, oh, shit, she's probably just, like, the stereotypical bratty goth kid. It's like, it's not a phase, Mom, I swear. And also in the phase of, I hate my parents, but not really. Which is another thing that a lot of people like to do when they write kid characters. Like sometimes it works, just sometimes it doesn't. We'll have to hold that off until we talk about like young adult story writing or some shit.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of a way to insert conflict like immediately, because like everybody knows when kids hate their parents, or when a kid is from a broken home, or it's like here's an easy way to just slip in conflict right away, so we already know that the situation is tense. And I don't know, sometimes you kind of just want a kid who's already happy to something to happen to this kid.
It's not a phase, Mom. Everyone's getting tattoos of DSP on their arm.
Oh boy.
Oh my god.
Okay.
That's gonna be some shit we discuss later.
If there's any, I know there's only like 4 people watching this, but if you know anybody who can do
5
like
people
a
watching
perfect impression of DSP, I have some great animation ideas I want to do.
Kindly hit us up, please. We would like to collaborate.
Oh man, like DSP is one of those people that if he was like a cartoon character, you'd love him, but then you realize he exists in real life and you get kind of depressed.
And you're like, oh, fuck.
In a way, I guess in a way he's like Dusty then.
Ooh, wow. Ooh, wow. Self-deprecating humor. Alright, fuck, shit. I guess we're kind of white.
Guys, I swear the mechanics are bugged.
So I guess we're kind of winding down now.
Yeah, pretty much. We know what we're doing for. I guess we got a bunch of ideas. So next episode, we're we're actually launching the crowdfunding live in the next episode.
Oh boy. That shit going on in the background while we discuss random creative shit. Creative type nonsense.
Or maybe we'll discuss, like, stuff, Monster Hospital stuff for it as well. Basically, we're doing an episode every night this weekend.
Oh boy.
Good luck.
This'll be fun.
We're all just want to tell you all good luck. We're all counting on you.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, yeah, for now...
Yeah.
For now...
Guess we're done here. This has been break room ruined superhero stories.
Well, wrong channel. This is the Brainfreezerrr podcast ruined superheroes.
So you just ruined the whole podcast.
What have you done?
We have to redo it. We have to redo it. Start over.
This has been Brainfreezerrr ruined superhero stories.
More like Brainfreezerrr ruins. No, I want to save that title for when we eventually actually read it or like play something. But yeah, we're gonna do game stuff on here as well. Basically, it's gonna be this kind of discussion, but about the game itself.
So now you'll get to hear our thoughts on game design stuff. Isn't that sound exciting?
Game design, game story. I can already think of I can already imagine what you guys' reactions are going to be to shit like Remember Me and BioShock Infinite.
Oh boy. That's gonna be a hassle and a fucking half.
But yeah. Yeah, thank you for joining us on the Brainfreezerrr podcast. I've been Slacker.
Alright, cool. I've been Shadow Angel.
I've been Cool's hands.
I'm not used to only Oh yeah, it's just the three of us tonight.
Yeah.
Until next time.
Good night.
See you guys.
Good night, everybody.